After a too long hiatus, welcome back to the Northern Pacific Railway History Project. Well, this is the 11th episode in our YouTube series. It also marks Chapter 1 in a little 4-part mini-series called Gold Spikes, in which we will look at the events and discoveries that led up to the building of the railroad system in the western United States. We'll look at the California missions, the Lewis and Clark expedition, the very first industrial revolution. We'll see how 3 very large pieces of land were assembled to complete the continental United States. We look at one of the very first railroad locomotives and then see the first railroad locomotive imported from Europe and the first railroad locomotive built in the United States. How the early wagon trails formed the basis for today's railroad lines. In the late 1840s, Easterners rushed to the western United States in order to get rich with gold. The Civil War of the 1860s was a great boon to the popularity of railroads. Wagon trains and stagecoaches got people to move west. And finally, the steam-powered riverboats were the last means of mechanized conveyance before the railroads took over. The first humans to arrive on the American continent came from Asia, and they crossed over the Bering Strait, which is that very narrow, maybe 50-mile-long stretch between the western tip of Russia and the eastern tip of Alaska. The first Europeans didn't arrive on the American continent until 1492, when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic and landed here. It wasn't for another 4 decades that any European would explore the inner part of what we now know as the United States. For that, he got a car named after him. In the year 1521, Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the South America to the Pacific Ocean, and he became the very first person to navigate the Earth. In the year 1542, Juan Cabrillo became the first European to explore present-day California. In the year 1565, the town of St. Augustine, Florida was founded, and it's still around today, the oldest continually occupied town in the United States. Still 305 years until the first Transcontinental Railroad would be completed. Just to get to our first mind-blowing revelation, we're going to go back to the beginning of the Earth, which was 4.5 billion years ago. Earth was formed out of gas and dust when the universe was about 8.5 billion years old. Homo sapiens didn't appear on Earth until about 300,000 years ago, and I know that some of our subscribers on this channel are Homo sapiens. I think all of you are going to be surprised at what we're about to discover. Let's convert Earth's 4.5 billion years into a timeline 5,280 feet long. Of the 5,280 feet in Earth's timeline, what length of that timeline is represented by Homo sapiens' existence on this Earth? If you take 1%, for instance, of the timeline that humans have inhabited the Earth, that would be 52.8 feet. Think fast. We get our answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Only 4 inches of that 5,280 feet, 4 inches of that mile, represents human inhabitation on planet Earth. We are Johnny-come-latelys. If you didn't get that answer right within 6 inches, you'd better hang on in here because you've got something to learn. I'm starting to think that this fella might make it easier than book learning. We move forward 150 years to the year 1769. Which is exactly 100 years before the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad. And technology so far has been moving very slow, but it's going to have to start galloping if we want to get railroad locomotives in motion. Finally, the first development takes place on the West Coast, and it's not Easterners coming west on wagon trains or stagecoaches. It is from the Spanish missionaries coming up from Mexico. The Padres build their missions beginning in the south near San Diego and then build 21 missions, each a distance of about a 1-day's horse ride from each other, with the final mission being built just north of San Francisco near Sonoma, California. The missions were the first buildings erected in the western United States and were large complexes, and some of them are still in use, like this mission in Santa Barbara, California. Many of these missions still stand, and some are even still in use, like the one in Santa Barbara, and they all welcome visitors. The local indigenous people were in awe of the missionaries' ability to build buildings and use metal. In return, the missionaries expected the local indigenous people to help them out with building the big missions and growing crops. The trail connecting the missions was 600 miles in length. This is Mission San Juan Bautista, which is just south of today's San Jose, California. I've tried to find parts of the California Mission Trail, but was eventually told that the only remaining stretch of the California Mission Trail was located behind San Juan Bautista. And these are pictures of that trail, and it's only maybe a half mile long. The other parts of the Mission Trail have since been covered by fields and roads and development. Today, the story of the missions is very often told as a positive one. However, the Padres could be very cruel to the Indians if they wanted to leave or didn't want to work. Sometimes the Indians would turn on the Padre. The leader of the missionaries was Father Junipero Serra. There are many paintings and statues of Father Serra, and here at the San Fernando Mission, which is located within the city of Los Angeles, he's glorified above the altar. By 1800, the United States had been formed as a country and backed on its west flank against the Mississippi River, and across the Mississippi River was a large part of the continental United States that was owned by the French. Shown here is the Louisiana Purchase. The French claimed the Mississippi River as well as the town of New Orleans, and Thomas Jefferson wanted the town of New Orleans and to have some access to the Mississippi River, so he sent a group of representatives over to France to talk to Napoleon Bonaparte, and they were to offer Napoleon $10 million for river access in the town of New Orleans. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte, he was always in a war. He was a Vladimir Putin type guy. He was always looking to take over more land. So representatives got over there, and he was battling, I think it was the British he was battling at that time, and he was in need of money to fund his war. And I think he realized that this piece of land out in the middle of nowhere at that time is something that he couldn't handle in addition to his wars. So for an additional $5 million over the $10 million that he was offered just for river access in the town, he said, I'll give you the whole area, which turned out to be quite the deal. With the very unexpected purchase of Louisiana from France and Napoleon, President Thomas Jefferson realized that we needed to get a pathway all the way from the Atlantic out to the Pacific, and he set his eyes on the area that was being claimed by Great Britain, which would be today's states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and a part of Montana. Great Britain had claimed that part of the continent, but had never really inhabited it, or neither had they paid anybody for it. Thomas Jefferson quickly organized a group of very brave men to go out and explore that area, and he put them under the command of William Clark, seen on the left here, and Meriwether Lewis. That group was known as the Corps of Discovery, and of course now is really known as better known as the Lewis and Clark expedition. The expedition set out with no maps and no real plan on where they were going. They did know that they were going into an uncivilized area with Indian tribes that they would have to deal with. Their expedition would take 2 years, and many people in St. Louis had given up on them even being alive. Many paintings have been made of the expedition and reported various events along the way. My own favorite painting is the one on the side of a building in a little town of Whitehall, Montana, which was a northern Pacific town. There's so much going on in this painting. Second from the left is William Clark, the red-haired gentleman. Next to him is the black man, York, and York's parents served as slaves to William Clark's parents. So these two grew up together, and by some reporting, they were childhood playmates. Off to the left with the rifle is Charbonneau, the French trapper, and to the right of York is Sacagawea, the young Indian woman who was married to Charbonneau, and Lewis and Clark picked up Charbonneau and Sacagawea during the trip. They didn't join them in St. Louis. They found them along the way. Sacagawea on her back is carrying their child, young Jean Baptiste. And when the expedition ended, Charbonneau and Sacagawea and Jean Baptiste went back to St. Louis, but Charbonneau and Sacagawea decided they wanted to return to the wilderness and left Jean Baptiste with William Clark. And as a consequence, Jean Baptiste got a very good education in Europe and became friends with people who were royalty and so on. Sacagawea was extremely helpful to the expedition, and there have been a number of books written about her. There's some question as to how her name was spelled. This page here is taken from my Kindle, which has the unabridged and unedited version of the Lewis and Clark journals on it. And her name is pronounced here Sacagawea. So that may be the correct pronunciation. I know growing up in Montana, we called her Sacagawea. Growing up, I thought that Lewis and Clark were the first explorers to cross the American continent north of Mexico. However, such was not the case. The Scottish explorer Alexander Mackenzie crossed the continent in the area of which is now Canada, back in 1789, which is about 13 or 14 years before the Lewis and Clark expedition. However, that Lewis and Clark were the first to cross the American continent in what we now know as the United States. While the United States was busy exploring its new treasures, Great Britain established itself as the world leader in technology and science and industry when in 1760 it started the very first industrial revolution. This very early steam locomotive was built in 1813 and is currently preserved in the Scottish National Museum in Edinburgh. The cask on the back of this locomotive is obviously for hauling water, but what about the coal? The job of this steam engine was to haul coal, so the operators of the locomotive had to stop every once in a while and poach from the load in order to keep the engine fueled. This is the first locomotive ever built in the United States. It's the Tom Thumb, built in 1829 by Peter Cooper. This locomotive was built mainly for exhibition purposes, and it never did get assigned a job. The first locomotive to be used in the United States was the Sturbridge Lion, which was actually built in Britain and came to the USA in the year 1829, the year before the Tom Thumb was built. While Great Britain was busy with its industrial revolution, adventurous souls in the United States began heading west into the country's new territories. For about a 50-year period, beginning in 1820, people went west by wagon train, and the trail mostly used is shown here in red, and that's the Oregon Trail. These wagon trains usually started in either St. Joseph, Missouri, St. Louis, or somewhere along there, and they would take the Oregon Trail up to around the Portland area, and eventually that Oregon Trail would turn into a Y with the California Trail going down into the Sacramento area. The wagons were crudely built and very small. The width of a wagon would be typically 4 feet, length would be 8 or 9 feet, and the sidewalls would be about 2 feet high. At night, when a wagon stopped, the animals hauling the wagons would be cut loose to go out and find their own food and water. Oxen were typically used to haul wagons because they were more reliable and that they stayed close to the wagon. Horses might wander off and you'd never find them again. The people on the wagon train would typically not ride on the wagon but would walk alongside the wagon because of the heavy weight that the oxen already had to haul. The wagon trip from Missouri out to the west would take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. The departure date for these wagon trains was very crucial. If you left too early, you'd get into impassable snow. If you left too late in the season, you'd run into snow before you got to your destination. So most of the wagon trains were leaving in the month of May or very shortly before that or after that. As you can tell by these photos, the wagons were very rickety and prone to breakdowns, especially breakdowns concerning the wheels. Originally, there were no maps available, and it was pretty much up to the wagon trains themselves to find their way out to the west. Eventually, toward the end of the wagon train era, the Campbell's Guide was published, and that was the very first travel guide to the western United States. It talked about various areas and places to settle down and how you get there and what to expect. When a pioneer finally got to a spot where they wanted to settle, they could use their wagon for farm work, and they would also build a home out of whatever native materials were available. It's time to bring our year up to 1848 and revisit our map, because something very crazy is happening here. It's been nearly 50 years since the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France and then sent Lewis and Clark up to the area shown as Great Britain on this map in order to take that area over for the United States. The one piece the United States is missing right now to put the whole continental United States, 48 states together, is the portion that's owned by Mexico. To get that parcel of land, the United States went to war with Mexico. And it was a war. Here's a modern-day drone look at the field where the Battle of San Pasqual took place in 1846 between the Mexicans and the Americans. Very bloody battle. This is located just a few miles east of San Diego. The war was finally ended in 1848 when on February the 2nd, both sides got together and signed a treaty. It cost the United States about $18 million to take over that 525,000 square miles of land. If the United States hadn't gotten this land, it wouldn't have become the strong country that was needed to help our allies in World War II. Had we not been able to do as much as we did in World War II, we might have a much different political landscape over there today and even here. The treaty that settled the war between the United States and Mexico was signed on February the 2nd, 1848. Incredibly, just 1 week prior to the treaty, on January 24th, 1848, gold was discovered at California's Sutter's Mill. So much gold that it caused the Great California Gold Rush. Sutter kept the news of the gold discovery secret for as long as he could, and when the treaty was signed a week later, neither the Mexican nor the United States government knew about the gold discovery, and it was so much. Had the Mexican government been aware of this gold, they certainly wouldn't have sold the property to the United States for $18 million, and we really have no idea of how this would have ended up. Perhaps that area of land would have stayed with Mexico and would not be a part of the United States today. If gold was discovered in California in January of 1848, why did it take until the following year, 1849, for the gold rush to begin? Sutter and his employee, John Marshall, wanted to keep the gold discovery secret so that they could mine as much of it as possible before word got out and other people started coming in and mining. Their employee, Charles Bennett, had such loose lips and was so excited about the find that he went out and announced it to the world, and it only took about a month for word of the discovery to get out. Remember that this was before the railroad or the Pony Express or the telegraph, and it took so long for word to get back east that the gold rush didn't start until early 1849, and hence the name 49ers, such as in San Francisco 49ers. When they heard there was seemingly gold everywhere in California, the Easterners wanted to get out there as quickly as possible. Taking a wagon train would take too long. The preferred method for getting to the gold country became sailing ships, would have to sail from the East Coast, say New York, go down all the way around South America, around Cape Horn, and back up to California. And that was a trip that was probably 3 or 4 times longer than the trip from New York to Great Britain. Sailing companies advertised trip lengths of 30 or 35 days, but of course it was longer than that. The crews on the ships that brought the gold miners often got so infected with the gold bug that they abandoned ship and stayed in California to mine. This photo shows abandoned ships in the San Francisco Bay. At the time of the gold discovery, there were only about 14,000 non-native residents in California. At the end of the following year, there were about 100,000 residents. The gold rush truly put California on the United States map as well as the world map. These two areas shown in pink drew the most miners. The lower area, the larger area, is straight east of Sacramento and San Francisco, and that's where most of the gold was found and where the most of the mining activity took place. Most California miners did placer mining, in which they looked for gold in the bottoms of creeks and rivers. There was very little hard rock mining done, which requires tunnels and going underground to find gold. Lots of Chinese miners came over and were treated poorly by those with a European background, mostly because they were smaller in size and dressed much differently, smoked opium, kept to themselves, and of course then there was the language barrier. The Chinese made their biggest mark in early American history when about 10 to 12 years after the gold rush started, they helped build the first Transcontinental Railroad. The gold rush lasted for about 10 years, and the miners' tools were pretty much limited to picks, shovels, and gold pans. Bigger and better equipment eventually came along, such as this big gold dredge, which is parked where it last worked up in near Nevada City, Montana. The ramp on the left of the dredge dug up the creek bottom and hauled it up to an area in the middle that separated the gold from the rocks and sand. The conveyor belt on the right side took the leftover sand and rock and deposited into tailings, as we see here on the side of the creek. You can be sure that that big dredge didn't pick up all the gold and that there's quite a bit left in these tailings, although I'm sure the state of Montana would not let anybody go in there and start mining again. This drawing shows the rather common practice of how miners rerouted rivers so they could dry out the riverbeds and go in and look for the gold that way. This picture from 1977 shows my brother Mark on the right and myself on the left. Back in 1978, we leased a large gold dredge in California and put it on the Stanislaus River, which is right in the middle of gold country. It was big enough to be run by a 4-cylinder car engine. The yellow lines on top of the water supplied us with air. We had on wetsuits because the water was so cold. We would go down and kneel on the river bottom, which would require wearing heavy weight belts to keep us submerged, and we would redirect that 12-inch hose to the river bottom, and that would send the river bottom up to the sluice box. How much gold did we get? Very little, but it was one of those adventures that made it all worthwhile. Remember those ships that were left in the San Francisco Bay? The gentleman on the left here is Cap Harmon, who actually owned and captained one of those ships that brought miners to California, and he stayed in California to go mining. And I don't know if he stayed because of the attraction of the mining, or perhaps he just didn't have any buddy to take back to New York or wherever he came from. Cap and his ship arrived in California in 1849, and for the next 60 years he mined in California. He lived as a recluse. He lived in a very crude cabin for at least 25 of those years. And his obituary states that when they found him, the body was rigid, death having occurred long before the finding of the body. This is the canyon where Cap lived, worked, and was buried. The only reason I know Cap's story is because I live about a mile or two from here and have hiked this canyon hundreds of times. However, I only discovered his story recently and wanted to mention him because these are the kinds of people whose memories we should keep alive. Stagecoaches began to appear toward the end of the wagon train era, and the very first stage was the Butterfield stage, also known as the Overland Mail Route. And this began in 1858, and it was a result of the federal government offering a contract to haul mail from St. Louis to San Francisco. The route was 2,800 miles long, and it took a stagecoach 25 days to make that route. In 1861, after just 3 years of being in business, the Butterfield stage sold out to the Wells Fargo, and this is probably originally an overland stage, although Its current paint scheme is Wells Fargo. This stage is located at the Buffalo Museum in North Dakota. Here's an 1867 map of the Wells Fargo routes. They significantly built up the stage routes. Here's what one early stage stop looked like. Here's a painting of another stage stop. This one was located in San Francisco Canyon between Palmdale, California and Santa Clarita, California. During the 2,800-mile, 25-day trip between St. Louis and San Francisco, the stages stopped only at the stations and didn't stop at night for bedding down. The stages just kept on rolling, and I've never seen or heard anything that shows how the stages illuminated the path for the horses. So many of the old Hollywood Western movies have stagecoaches in them, and there's almost always a woman coming in on the stagecoach in those cases. The women always look pretty well dressed and very fresh, but that probably was never the case. Passengers were limited to 25 pounds of luggage, and it's hard to imagine anybody making the trip from St. Louis to San Francisco with just 25 pounds of luggage. Stagecoaches were primarily used to haul the mail in small packages. Long-haul stagecoaches quickly disappeared after the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. This stagecoach photo was taken in 1902 in Gardner, Montana, when the Northern Pacific Railroad shuttled people from its Livingston, Montana depot down to Gardner, where stagecoaches would ferry them through Yellowstone National Park. There are still places in the United States where you can see wagon and stagecoach tracks, and here's one of them. This is in Montana, near Ennis, Montana. It's part of the old Bozeman Trail, which was closed in 1866 due to Indian massacres. This is very visible from Highway 287, which would be off to the left in this video. We are in the year 1850. Iron has been in use for the past few thousand years, and the first practical steam engine, which was used for pumping water, was invented in 1712. In the 50 years, why haven't we come up with a steam engine like this, which is much, much more powerful and can haul dozens of cars and is well adapted to long-distance travel? In other words, what's keeping us at this level of technology when we could be at this level? The problem was that iron was just too brittle and would break under the heavy stress of a larger steam locomotive. But in 1856, the Bessemer process was invented, which was a means of extracting impurities out of iron, and this allowed iron to be manufactured into steel, and this was huge. Steel is so much stronger. With steel available, we could build locomotives like this, and this one, and look at what all these locomotives are riding on, steel rails. Iron would just not stand up to the weight of a heavy steam locomotive. We needed steel for that. The availability of steel allowed us to build big riverboats like this that would haul heavy cargo up and down rivers like the Mississippi and the Missouri. It would allow warships like this. For the first time, tall buildings were built. Before this, building height pretty much maxed out at about 4 stories. And it would allow us to build long bridges like this one, which would carry the heavy steam locomotives over wide rivers like the Mississippi and the Missouri. This bridge was built in 1882 by the Northern Pacific Railroad, and it crosses the Missouri River near Bismarck, North Dakota. The availability of inexpensive and widely available steel blew the doors off manufacturing. Railroads were one of the industries that benefited the most from steel that suddenly became available for their use. Again, here's the Northern Pacific Railroad's Bismarck Bridge as it crosses the Missouri River at Bismarck, North Dakota. This bridge was just being finished at the time of this photo, and if we zoom in, we can see that there are 8 Northern Pacific Railroad steam locomotives on the middle span of that bridge. Each one of the spans of the bridge were tested with the heaviest loads possible. Back and forth travel between the continents was popularized by steel-hulled ocean liners. It's difficult to imagine how cars and trucks would ever have been invented without steel. Steel was used in manufacturing the machines that manufactured other steel parts. Farmers sought larger parcels of land as they could now harvest more crops. The telephone came about. Mass production greatly multiplied the country's industrial output, but it wasn't all a bed of roses. The American Indians did not fare so well. About the same time period that wagon trains were heading west, steamboats were another alternative to going west. On this map, the Mississippi River is shown in the blue. Then we see the little green box there. That would be St. Louis, Missouri. From St. Louis, you could actually get on the Missouri River, which is the yellow line there, and you could go all the way up through North Dakota and into Montana and go all the way up to Fort Benton, Montana. Fort Benton is where the yellow line meets the green line, and that's the end of the navigable waters on the Missouri River. Down at the far end of the green line is where the Madison, Gallatin, and Jefferson rivers come together near Three Forks, Montana to form the Missouri River. And of course, the Northern Pacific Railroad goes right by there. If the train stopped, you could just walk over and see where those rivers join up. Steam power was in its infancy at that time, and there were a lot of boiler explosions on steamboats because people didn't regulate the steam pressure appropriately. The steamboats used wood to fire their boilers with, and they went through huge amounts of wood to heat the boilers. And they would have to stop every day to get more wood, and they couldn't take the time for the crew to go out and forage for wood, so they relied on people, usually single guys, along the river, camped out along the river, who would saw the wood and gather it on the shore and then sell it to the passing steamboats. And I've always found the Woodhawks to be they must have been an interesting bunch, because that was an extremely dangerous job. They were cutting wood down along the Missouri River that the Indians must have been irate over that. And there aren't figures as to how many Woodhawks were killed doing that job, but I think it must have been one of the most dangerous jobs in America at that time. The steamboat era pretty much ended as soon as the Transcontinental railroads came through. It was just a much better way to get out west. Here is a picture of a steamboat fully loaded with people against a bridge, and it shows a train there, and that's the original Bismarck Bridge across the North Dakota. That's the Northern Pacific's bridge, and picture would have been taken in 1883 or 1884, or maybe a year or two after that. But it's interesting that it shows the steamboat fully loaded, but yet there's a train in the background. Here are some photos showing the very upper part of the navigable portion of the Missouri River. I took these photos back in 1980 when my mom wanted to take a canoe trip from Fort Benton down about 30 miles of river. We took our time, took a week, and enjoyed this river. But you can see how little wood there is along the river and how difficult it would be to fire these steamboats. Here's an archway with myself in it. We hiked to the tops of the cliffs, and at one point we found some teepee rings. My dad's side of the family came to Montana by steamboat in the 1800s. Well, we're here in Colson, Montana, which is now a part of Billings, Montana, and this is where my family started life, pretty much up here in Montana. It was back before 1883. It was probably around 1880. My grandfather, who was a very young boy, 5 at that time, came with his family up the Missouri River from St. Louis area, went up to Fort Benton, where that's the last stop on the Missouri because of the falls up there. For some reason, they came back down here to Colson. This was before the railroad had even come through. The railroad reached here and gave service in 1883, and they arrived here probably in 1880 or 1881. And why they came to Colson, I don't know. There couldn't have been too much happening here. The Pony Express Company built a long route with 184 stations placed about 10 miles apart, equipped with some 400 horses and 80 riders. A rider would ride a horse between stations, 10 miles, change horses, and gallop on from there. The riders might ride 8 hours or more. And they only carried 20 pounds of mail in a little sack. Even though the occupation is glorified here, being a Pony Express rider must have been a very lonesome, very dangerous occupation. And that business, the Pony Express, only lasted a year because in 1861, the telegraph line between New York to California was complete. One thing I've never read anything about, and I've been very curious about, is where did they get the power to send the signals, especially since the lines are iron and they must have needed a lot of power to send the signals through. Western Union still exists today, and obviously in a much smaller form. Today it's just a way to send money. In a further effort to populate the western United States, in 1862 the federal government came up with the Homestead Act, which would give 160 acres to people who are willing to go out into the West and farm that land. There are just a couple of requirements. One would be that they farm the land for at least 5 years and reside there, and the other being that the land had to be surveyed. And that was a great boon to the railroad companies because they would get business from the farmers along their lines. Another rule, there weren't too many rules in getting that land, but one of them was that you couldn't have fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. That ends the first episode and sets the scene for our next episode, which is the construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad and how it factored into being the most important part of the settlement of the western United States. For that, we travel to the top of California's Sierra Nevada mountain range, where we take a first-hand look at the most famous railroad construction project in American history, and that's the building of the tunnels going over the Sierra Nevada range. And we'll visit that area in both the winter and the summer. Los Angeles was still just a small burg at that time, and in Chapter 3 of the Gold Spike series, we'll take a look at how the railroad was built from Northern California down to Los Angeles and finally opened up that area for development. Finally, in Chapter 4 of the Gold Spike series, we'll take a look at the world's most difficult railroad construction jobs. So, if you haven't already, please subscribe, give me a like, make a